Hello everybody, my name is Jim Pingle and welcome to our July 2016 Hangout. This time we're doing a second part of high availability. The last one was about a year ago. It's up in the Hangout archive, and I've got the specifics on when they were posted at the end here. This time for the second part we're going to be talking about HA with multi-WAN and also the basics of converting an existing firewall over to an HA cluster. In this Hangout, we'll talk about the project news as usual. We'll do a brief review of the components of HA. We'll do HA with the multi-WAN overview, and then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about adding a WAN to an existing HA cluster. I've got an example you might be able to see in the background that has an HA cluster, test cluster with two WANs. And we'll also talk about converting an existing system to HA. I don't have a demo for that, but I will go over, the whole procedure that you have to follow. And then I'll have a brief review of testing and troubleshooting of HA, and then we should have some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, go ahead and keep them in your pocket for now, and then we'll get to them toward the end. First up on the project news, if you haven't heard yet, Chris, one of our founders, is leaving the project. He was lured away and he has announced that he is going off to Ubiquity for a different project outside of FreeBSD and open source in general, so it's a proprietary thing. So we wish him well, and he was lured away, and he's gonna, he felt confident leaving us now that we've got a pretty good base of employees, and we're at a place now where he felt comfortable leaving it in our hands. So we're all still chugging along, and we're going to miss him. But he left a couple of notes on the forum and elsewhere, basically saying farewell. So if you go to the forum, find that thread, you can chime in and wish him well. Our 2.3.2 release is out. Had a couple of bug fixes, a couple of small features. It wasn't too far off of 2.3.1 under patch level 5 or patch 5. But we wanted to get one last release out before Chris left, make sure we had all the procedures down and documented and everything. One of the more visible things about the 2.2.3.2 release is we do have NTOP NG back. It had some time to bake in our development snapshots, and we did some fixes to it, and it's running pretty well. And there's also a traffic totals package, which is based on VNstat, that more accurately will track interface bandwidth usage. People were missing that from the RRD graphs, but the data that was presented as a total from RRD was a guess. It was inaccurate. It wasn't really great. This should be a much more accurate solution. Also, the license for pfSense, we changed it to the Apache license 2.0. It is a BSD compatible license, but it has more clear language on copyright, patents, and trademarks. It's a very popular license used on a lot of major projects. It's one of the top few licenses on GitHub. There's a lot more information on the blog about that if you want to follow the link there and look at that blog post later. We also want to remind you about our official Facebook page for pfSense. We have it's facebook.com/pfSense. That's up and running and going again. We also have a new Facebook group. It's our new official group that's run by us. There were some community-run groups out there before, but we wanted to have our own that we had control of officially. And so everything is up there. It's at the URL you see there, facebook.com/groups/pfsense.official. All right. Before I start this, somebody was asking if the Hangout started. Yeah, it's started. I guess they're not hearing audio. If somebody wants to tell them on chat, they may have to exit out and come back in, or they may have to do something. But it has started, and everything should be running. All the tests I did checked out, so we're up and live. Let's see here. What we have here is a little bit more complicated diagram than we had the last time. On the left-hand side is just a basic cluster. You've got your two nodes, your primary, your secondary. You've got your LAN and your WAN, and that's it. There's just the one shared CARP address on the LAN, and the one shared CARP address on the WAN. They've got their synchronization stuff, but that's like your basic, simplest cluster you can have at that right there. And then on the right-hand side, for comparison, we have our much more complicated setup, and this is a diagram of the setup that's actually running in the virtual setup. I've got in that other window over there. It has two WANs and a LAN and a DMZ all CARP together. So each of those interfaces, the LAN, the DMZ, the WAN, and WAN2, they all have CARP set up on them, and they all have their own individual addresses in them, plus the sync interface. So in total, they have 5 interfaces. Just a quick review of the components of a high availability cluster. In your simplest case, you're going to have, or the most common case anyway, you're going to have 2 nodes, a primary node and a secondary node, and they work together to do active and active passive failover, not active. So there's one logical unit that everything talks through, and if the primary goes down, the secondary takes over, but that should be a seamless transition for your clients going through, assuming you can get a proper CARP setup. Oh, sorry about that. The IP address redundancy is handled by CARP, or Common Access Redundancy Protocol, which is an implementation, a re-implementation of VRRP, but not patent encumbered, but that patent's expired. So some things are going to be changing up there. The heartbeats for CARP are transmitted on interfaces with the CARP VIPs, not the sync interface. That's a pretty common misconception people have. Even though a cluster node is connected, with their sync interface, the heartbeat traffic that says, okay, I'm alive, that doesn't happen on the sync interface. That happens on every interface where there's a CARP VIP, so that they can properly detect if one node can't see the other on each segment individually. And so the IP address redundancy works when you're flowing through. Any traffic going to the cluster from an outside source, like your LAN or a WAN source, should be going to your CARP VIP. So what that means is your local clients would be using your gateway and DNS of the CARP VIP to go through, so that they're always talking to the CARP VIP. Upstream, if you have a VPN, you'd want to bind that to a CARP VIP. If you've got a routed block of addresses coming from your ISP, they would route that to your CARP VIP. So everybody talks to the CARP VIP coming in, and also everything should originate from the CARP VIP going out. So like your LAN traffic will come through, and if it's privately addressed, you want to NAT that to a CARP VIP on the way out. That way, all of your state table entries are going to match up when we have your state synchronization. So, it's going to be going out the CARP VIP on both. It will be a seamless transition. Things coming in will always find the CARP VIP, and the CARP VIP will always get picked up by whichever node is master at the time. So that all comes together to provide IP address redundancy all the way across. The next component is configuration sync, which is handled by XML RPC. Now that does communicate over the sync interface. It's basically where the GUI process will talk to one GUI process will talk to another GUI process, and they synchronize settings from a bunch of different supported areas. So when you make a change on your primary, that will synchronize over to the secondary. It does not go the other way. So you have to remember that you only make your changes on the primary in those sections. Otherwise, the changes are going to get blown away when you do them on the secondary. Now there are lots of areas that don't sync, like your individual interface settings, your advanced settings under System Advanced, things like that, or the hardware settings. Those are unique per node, so you do have to make sure those get done manually on both. But in the supported sync areas, you only ever want to edit the primaries. Next component is state synchronization, which is handled by pfSense. Now that also communicates via the sync interface, and it's a protocol that goes back and forth between the 2 nodes, and it communicates changes to the state table, state insertions, state deletions, and changes. So anytime like a new connection is formed, the primary will send a message to the secondary saying, hey, okay, here's a new connection. So they know about all those connections. And if the primary goes down, the secondary already knows about those, and because it has all the states and the traffic is going through the CARP VIPs, it's a seamless transition. Again, there's nothing to get cut off in terms of plain IP traffic. Now, it's not quite so smooth for things like VPNs that would have to reconnect, but for plain IP traffic, Hard to beat there. Goes straight on through. And another important component is your switches. Your switches have to be set up to properly handle multicast traffic. There are some caveats here in terms of switches and different implementations. Some people have had to disable things like IGMP snooping. We have a whole laundry list of adjustments that need to be made on VMware vSwitches. Things like you have to allow forged transmits, you have to allow promiscuous mode, and there's another one I can't think of off the top of my head. MAC address changes, that's what it is. So you have to allow all of those on a vSwitch in order for CARP to work. And those are kind of messy to have on for a whole segment. So you can do just a port group for your HA cluster and the VMs that has that enabled, but even though it's not on the whole vSwitch. So there are ways around that. So if you use CARP VIPs in VMware, you need to be aware of that. We have all of that covered in the book and on the wiki. If you look up like CARP troubleshooting on the doc wiki at doc.pfSense.org, there's a whole big long list of things you can check. Some things only apply to older versions of ESX. If you're on a current version of ESX, things are pretty smooth, except you still do have to allow those three things I mentioned. All right, moving along. A couple of general things to talk about for HA with multi-WAN before I actually show anything. A concept we get asked very frequently if we can do this another way, but it's just not possible. When you have HA with multi-WAN, both WANs have to be connected to both units. You can't have like one ISP on your primary and a different ISP on your secondary. That's just not going to work. Because there's no way to trigger a failover from one node to another based on your gateway status. So if your WAN goes down on your primary, there's nothing that's going to trigger a failover to your secondary. And even if you could do that, it is not proper redundancy, because if your secondary was down and your primary ISP went down, you'd be completely dead. And the reverse is true too. If your primary went down and your secondary ISP went down, either way, if one of your nodes in the opposite WAN went down, you're dead. So you need to have both WANs connected to both units. So everything needs to be the same on all of them. And by consequence, that means you need to have a switch in front of each WAN, and not just like the cheap switches on the back of like CPEs and modems and routers and things given by your ISP. You want to make sure you have an actual real switch there. Another thing is both WANs have to have static addresses, and they have to be a /29 or larger. Well, at least we recommend they be, because each node, as usual with CARP, requires an IP address in each subnet. So that means one IP address for the primary, one IP address for the secondary, one IP address for CARP, plus your ISP gateway. That's for the smallest usable subnet that can fit in is a /29. So you need to make sure you have that, at least that much. Technically, with CARP on pfSense 2.3, you can have a /30 where your CARP VIP is a /30 and your interface addresses are in some privately numbered subnet, but we don't recommend doing that really if you can get away without it, because if you do that, your secondary would have no way to communicate out over that, even to check gateway status, as long as it's the secondary. If the primary is the CARP master, it's the only one that's going to be able to talk out that WAN. So it's not very useful to do that, but if you have no other choice, it can be done. And by consequence, because you have to have static addresses, that means you cannot do DHCP and PPPoE WANs with multi-WAN and HA, at least not for proper CARP, because when you have those, your IP addresses are going to be dynamic. There's not going to be a way to fail over between one of those and the other, because there's no way for the states to be the same. You can't do a CARP VIP in those. So everybody would get disconnected, and you can't. They couldn't detect master backup status on that interface, and it's just not a very good way to do things. Now, if you abstract that a little bit, you take that DHCP or PPPoE and put it on some device in front of pfSense on that WAN, whether it's done in your modem or whatever, then you can do that. As long as pfSense sees a static subnet of /29 or larger, it's okay. If you don't have a very forgiving ISP and you have to do that and you don't have another subnet available to route into there, You could use a private subnet, and you could do NAT there. We don't recommend it, but the benefits of the extra redundancy may outweigh the negative factors of NAT in your case. That's something you'll have to address on an individual basis. If you really want to on there, you could do like a one-to-one NAT from the NAT device back to the CARP VIP, and that would negate some of the problems you'd have with CARP, but it's still, it's still not something we recommend, but, we've seen people do it, they've gotten by with it, and it's been acceptable in some cases, especially if it's like a secondary or tertiary WAN, and it's really just there for some extra outbound access, and you're really not caring about inbound traffic on it. When it comes to doing your gateway groups and policy routing and everything for multi-WAN, that is almost all going to be the same as a traditional multi-WAN setup, with the exception of when you set your gateway groups, like under System and Routing here, on the Gateway Groups tab. When you edit these, you want to pick your VIPs on your group. Like, see, here's WAN, Tier 1, and I've got my HA VIP. It's not so important for a load balancing group, but for a failover group that can be used as an interface binding for something like IPsec or OpenVPN or DynDNS, then you want to make sure you have these VIPs selected, because that's what's going to be used by these various daemons for binding when it comes time to use that. So it's pretty handy to use for those situations. Otherwise, that's all going to be the same, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about all of this in a moment. But you do all that. You need to set up your DNS for multi-WAN, which I covered a lot back in the March Hangout. There's a lot of factors you need to be concerned about there, especially if you're using the DNS resolver, because you might have to make some adjustments to that to be in forwarding mode versus non-forwarding mode to make that play nice with multi-WAN. But we've got that's all documented very well in other places, so I didn't want to get too far into that because that's a pretty long conversation. You want to use gateway groups and rules to configure failover load balancing, just like always with multi-WAN. And you want to do your policy route negation, and I'll show you some of those rules here in a minute. And also you need to make sure you make your outbound NAT adjustments to make sure that your outbound NAT is using CARP VIPs on both WANs. So if you're already using CARP and you're adding another WAN to it, you're already going to have those NAT rules for your main WAN. You just need to follow that example and adjust those for your second WAN. Okay, so the actual procedure about going about adding a WAN to an HA cluster. First up, you need to add the WAN NIC to both, if you don't have it already on the hardware. If you're using like one of our SG devices that's got a bunch of NICs, you probably already have a NIC available. You just assign it, off you go. If you do need to add a physical NIC, that's something you want to make sure you get the same one for both. Power off secondary, add the hardware, power it on, make sure it's working, and then do the same for the primary. Or if you're using like a VLAN tag, there's nothing special. You just add the tag to both. It doesn't matter the order there. You do need to make sure you have the interfaces assigned in the right order. If we look on here, we need to make sure, like I've got WAN, LAN, DMZ, sync, and WAN 2. And on my secondary, it's the exact same order: WAN, LAN, DMZ, sync, and WAN 2. Now, your WAN won't be assigned yet, so it'll just be in the available network ports. You can just pick it from the list and do that. Or in some cases, you might have already assigned it as an opt interface, but just not enabled it, so it may already be there. And then in which case, you just move right along to the next step, which is to go up to your interfaces menu, and it'll be opt whatever, or if you renamed it to WAN 2 yet. So on each of these, starting with the primary, you want to enable the interface, rename it, set it for static IP address, put in your IP address and your subnet mask, and put in your gateway here. You can use that add new gateway button to input a new gateway, or you can save this, then go and edit under system and routing, add a gateway there, then come back and pick it. Either way is okay. It's much quicker to use the add a new gateway button here. You want to do this first and save it and apply it, because that gateway entry is going to synchronize over to the secondary for you automatically. So when you come over here to the secondary, do the same thing, enable the interface, call it WAN 2, give it a static address, obviously a different static address in the same subnet. And then you pick the gateway. If the gateway doesn't show as available in this list, save this setting and go back and edit the interface again, and then it'll be picked. Then you can pick it and then save and apply. So, but you won't have to add this gateway on the secondary. It will be pushed over here by the primary. You just need to make sure that you don't add it twice and that you don't pick the wrong one. So make sure you're picking the gateway from the list and not actually adding a new one when you're doing it on the secondary. So after you've got your interfaces configured and selected and the gateway selected, you can add a CARP VIP to the WAN just on the primary, and that will automatically synchronize over to the secondary. That's easy to do. And then you worry about your outbound NAT rules on your primary only. Go over here to Firewall and NAT on the outbound tab. And you can see here, I'm in hybrid mode. You might be in manual mode on your cluster. I have a set of rules here for WAN, source of any private network. I've got my static port rules for VoIP, or not VoIP, static port rules for IPsec. And then I've got my other, just a general NAT rule that randomizes the source port for everything else. And you'll notice I have two sets of rules. I have the rules on WAN that translate to the WAN CARP VIP, and then I have rules on WAN 2 that translate to the WAN 2 CARP VIP. And then, so once you have all of those present, everything will be fine. Paul, you said you were having trouble getting Fuse working. Yes, the video and the slides will both be available in the Hangout archive. They'll be uploaded. I'll upload it tonight, but I don't know if it'll get posted this evening yet. It might be Monday before it's all up, but it will all be up. All right, so your outbound NAT should be pretty simple to do. Especially if you were already on manual, you've already got WAN, you can just copy the rules and adjust the interface and adjust the CARP VIP. Easy peasy. So like I showed you a minute ago, for your gateway groups, and the NAT settings also will be synchronized over to the secondary. That's no concern. For the gateway groups, I like to make 3 gateway groups. I like a load balance group and then one each to prefer, like one to prefer WAN, one to prefer WAN 2. Every scenario is going to be different. You may not need all of these. I like to have them all. It doesn't hurt to have them all. And down the road, it saves me from having to do more work later if I decide later I want to use one of these other scenarios in a specific rule. It's better to just have it there, and especially because it's not going to hurt anything to have it there. And when you make these groups, you want to make sure, just to reiterate, that you select your CARP VIPs along with the tiers. And so I've got my load balance with both WANs on tier 1, got prefer WAN 1 with WAN 1 on tier 1, WAN 2 on tier 2, and then prefer WAN 2 that has WAN 2 on tier 1 and WAN on tier 2. And on each of these, I've got the CARP VIP selected in the virtual IP column. Now, once that's all set up, you can come over here to status and see, the gateway group status, everything shows online. Gateway status, everything shows online, everything's happy. Double check that on the secondary. Gateway status is online. Gateway group status are all online, so that's all good. So if you had any existing daemons and settings like VPNs or other, any other things you had, like maybe HA proxy or whatever, you might have to make some concessions for those with multi-WAN as usual. There are a lot of details for all of that back in the multi-WAN hangout. The nuts and bolts of it is, like with a VPN like IPsec, you might want to set it up to use a gateway group. OpenVPN, you can set a gateway group, but I don't like to do the gateway group with OpenVPN. What I like to do instead is to bind that to localhost and then add port forwards. So in this case, I'd bind my OpenVPN to localhost on, say, port 1194, for example, and then I would add a port forward on WAN 1 for a destination of the CARP VIP port 1194 going to localhost 1194. And then on WAN 2, I'd add a port forward for the WAN 2 CARP VIP 1194 to localhost 1194. And there's an option in the export package to pick up on those port forwards when it exports, and it'll just do the right thing. And it's really, really easy to do. And also, even if you don't do multi-WAN, you still want to make sure your VPNs are bound to a CARP VIP. If you've already got an existing HA cluster, odds are they are, but you want to just something to double check. It's a good time to double check you've got that set up right. And again, previous details details are all in that March Hangout. So that's it for multi-WAN. So everything is all set there. If we have any questions about that, we'll deal with them at the end. But I want to move on to converting to CARP, which I'll get to in just a second. I just need to get a drink here. Just a moment. All right, sorry about that. I had somebody knocking on my door too. Okay, so let's move on to converting to CARP. So there's several. This is just a little summary, and then we'll get into a lot more detail here in a moment. First off, we need to prepare for the conversion. So there's some planning you need to do. Things like maintenance windows and address planning, things like that. Then you'll need to make adjustments to your primary so that it will be a primary and not just a standalone firewall. You'll need to prepare your secondary and then set up your sync interface and do pfSync, XML RPC, and DHCP. So first up with our initial tasks here for converting to CARP, first things first, you need to do some planning and find a maintenance window because there will be a little bit of an outage as you make these address adjustments. So you need to make sure that whenever you do this, you've got time to have a little bit of downtime. It's not going to be an extended outage, but as you change these addresses over, there is going to be some downtime between the time when you change your addresses and add your CARP VIPs. So, and there could be some outage, some downtime as things need to pick up on the new CARP, on the new MAC addresses for the IP addresses. You will have to plan your address usage, especially if you're converting. You may have to combat things that are already in use. So for example, if your LAN is 192.168.1.1, to use the simplest little example, normally in that case, you'd want your CARP primary to be like .2 and your secondary to be .3, and then you'd have .1 as your CARP VIP. So what you end up having to do is make sure that .2 and .3 are free. They may not be. You may have to use like .252 and 253 or something else. You want to make sure they're next to each other, easy to find, some address that you know for sure. We have a lot of more info in that last hangout on planning your address usage, also a lot more in the book and on the wiki as well. So you want to make sure that you change your host name on this firewall too to indicate that it's part of a cluster. So we've got like, instead of being firewall.example.com, you could do like firewall A, firewall 1, firewall primary. You could have, famous pairs of twins from mythology or something, Castor and Pollux or whatever, it doesn't matter, from your favorite TV show or movie, just famous pairings, whatever. But it just something to indicate that these are now a part of a team. And not just one individual entity when you're looking at these. Oh, just a second again. Sorry about that. Another little distraction there. Okay. So once you've got your host name set, you need to move your firewall over to a new IP address. So when you were planning, you had to do what you were going to do. Now you're actually going to move it. So you need to go into like your interfaces in LAN, change your interface over to your new assignment, and do that for all of your interfaces. So you need to move your primary over to a completely new set of IP addresses all around. And then you need to add those old IP addresses as CARP VIPs. So in the first example, like you'd move your LAN from 192.168.1.1 to 192.168.1.2. Save and apply that, and then go and add a CARP VIP for 192.168.1.1. So after that point, logically, things that were talking to 1.1 will still talk to 1.1. But when you make that change, until you do some adjustments to DHCP, which we'll get here in a moment, if things pick up a new lease, they'll start talking to 1.2 because we haven't made all of our adjustments yet. So just need to be aware of that. You'll need to add an interface for sync traffic. That might mean powering the system off to add another NIC, or it may just mean assigning another NIC. We don't like to do that on a VLAN, but you could if you had to. And again, as before I mentioned, you need to configure it with a new sync network, static addresses, firewall rules, and whatnot. So you need to make sure you have all that set. And that's all the same as just your traditional CARP setup. Now you want to go into your DHCP settings, and I'll show this to you here. In your DHCP server settings, on every local segment you have that's doing DHCP, you want to set your DNS server to the CARP VIP if you're using the firewall for DNS, and you want to set the gateway to the CARP VIP so that things will use the CARP VIP as their gateway. Not yet, but eventually we'll be setting this failover peer IP, but you do not want to set this yet because we don't have a failover peer yet. As long as your secondary is non-existent, whether you're getting ready to add it or you've just removed it, you want to take out that failover peer IP. That way the primary won't care about a peer when it's handing out addresses. So right now, all you need to have set special is the DNS server set to the CARP VIP, gateway set to the CARP VIP, and the failover peer should be empty and blank at this point. You can go ahead and configure outbound NAT to use the CARP VIP like I showed you a bit ago. You could go to hybrid mode and make your own new rules. You could switch to manual mode and adjust the default rules. Either way is up to you. Configure your VIPs to use the VPN or VPNs to use the VIP for their interface settings if you want. So like you'd edit your OpenVPN or IPsec and bind those to the CARP VIP for their interface instead of the other settings directly. Like for example, if we look at, I don't know if this one, yeah, I had IPsec. When we look at the binding for the interface, see, instead of being on WAN, I have it set to a VIP on WAN. And that way that's where it's going to listen. Same goes for any other service on the firewall, whether it's VPNs or whatever. You just edit them, make sure they're bound to the CARP VIP. Especially with packages, some packages have support for that, some don't. It's just something to be aware of. Okay, well at that point, when you're in that state where you've got your CARP VIPs all set and you've got your other settings all set, your NAT set, your DHCP set, but no failover set in the DHCP, at this point you can run like this as a standalone unit just fine. You're not committed to any further changes. You could do that in one maintenance window until you're happy with how it's settled, and then move on and add the secondary later. As that other person mentioned, if you were going to tear down a cluster, you could go back to this state with all of your CARP VIPs and everything set. And we don't have our failover set, and we don't have our synchronization stuff set, so it's okay. So if you're going the opposite direction, you'd tear down your CARP secondary, you'd take out your DHCP failover, you'd take out your XML RPC sync settings, you'd take out your pfSense settings, and then you'd be fine. You could run as a standalone unit like that just fine. You don't have to convert those CARP VIPs back to IP aliases. You don't have to readjust your DHCP. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. So like I said, you could do this all together, or you could pause here and then wait until you've got your other hardware ready. You could do this as a planning move months in advance if you want. But at this point, you're fine. It's ready to be a CARP primary, but it's not crossed the threshold of actually being in that role yet. All right, so the next step is going to be to set up the sync interface. I already mentioned assigning it, enabling it, numbering it, and everything on both of them. You do need to double check you've got rules on the sync interface. I've got some example rules here. We covered those in a lot of detail in the previous Hangout. You at least need to pass the GUI traffic, so that's TCP 443. You need to pass pfSense traffic for the state synchronization, and you don't have to pass ICMP echo, but it's nice for diagnostic purposes to make sure they can talk to each other. On the secondary, you need to add a rule to pass any to any on the sync interface. And then once your synchronization settings are in place, it will clobber that with the rules you put on the primary. So that's handy. After you do that, you configure pfSync, and that's down here under System and then High Availability Sync. This part happens on both units. So you have synchronized states checked. You'll pick your sync interface and you'll put in the peer's address in the sync subnet. So this is 10.11.2.3. Over here, we got 10.11.2.2. Now and then after you've done that, you can go ahead and save. You don't have to save on the primary just yet, but you want to save on the secondary at least, because that's it for this page for the secondary. Now for the XML RPC settings, you want to put in the synchronized config to IP here. You want to put in the secondary's IP address, the remote system name, and the username and password. And the username and password should be admin, and then it will be the same password used for the GUI here. And then for the sections you want to do, you can just hit toggle all, and that'll do it and save. But in doing that, for some reason, I'm thinking I might have skipped something. Maybe I skipped preparing the secondary. So before you get to that point, before you save before you save the settings for the XML RPC on the primary, you want to make sure your secondary is up and in use. I think I must have skipped this slide because I don't remember talking about it. First, you want to bring up the secondary in an isolated way. It could be connected to a WAN as long as it's connected in a way that is not going to conflict with anything. Don't plug it like into the LAN of your existing network. But you just want to bring it up in an isolated way and connect a PC or laptop to the LAN, but don't connect the WAN unless you can do it safely. And then just go through all the basic setup. Give it a host name similar to the primary, like this is firewall B, firewall 2, firewall secondary, whatever. Assign all the interfaces in identical order, just like I showed you before. So they have to be in identical order. Enable and configure all the interfaces. Use the same names as the primary in the same order. Use the same scheme. All the same subnets, but obviously different IP addresses so they don't conflict. You don't need to add VIPs or very many rules. You just need to add your sync interface pass rule, like I mentioned. Your GUI has to be running the same port and protocol. Usually it's 443 TCP, and the same has to have the same admin password. Once you've got that set, the basics set up, then you can hook it up to everything, and then you're good to go. And you configure can go back and configure your pfSync settings on the secondary, and then once you configure the XML RPC settings over here on the secondary, then it's all good. At that point, you're going to start pushing these settings in all these supported sections over to the secondary, and you can see there's quite a lot of things that will synchronize. Now that we've got all that set up, now you can go back to your DHCP settings and only on the primary fill in this failover peer address. And once you've got that filled in, it will automatically synchronize that over and do the necessary adjustments for the secondary. Like if I go over here to the secondary and look at my DHCP settings there, it has changed that so it points back to the primary. So that's all good. And then repeat that for any other local interfaces. Like if you have DHCP on your other local interfaces, like a LAN 2 or a VoIP subnet, whatever, you'll have to make that same adjustment everywhere. Then when you check out the status, you'll see it's on, at least for me here, it's a normal. And if I check my status here, normal. So everything looks good. Now the reason you don't want to put that failover address in too soon is because if the primary is up with the failover address in place and it never talks to the secondary, it will not hand out addresses because it won't know what to do. They have to agree on what addresses they're going to do because both of these units will serve addresses the whole time. They share lease information. So like one will share info out of the lower end of the subnet, another out of the higher end of the subnet, and they'll share lease information back and forth. So everything, and so it's not unusual, and it's actually expected to see the units both hand out leases. But as long as your settings are right, pointing to the CARP VIP for your gateway and DNS, and your failover settings are right, everything will be happy. There won't be any conflicts. They will share the lease information, and they're fine. So that's the end of it, really. Once you've done that, you should have a working CARP cluster. You can go through and do all your testing. You know, like I've got here, this is the same from the previous CARP Hangout. Check that you got a LAN that can go all the way out through a LAN client. Make an edit to like a firewall rule and make sure that you go over to the secondary and see that it's synced. Or you can go to status filter reload, force a sync, and look at the status. Go to status and CARP and verify CARP. Like if I go over here to status and CARP, you can see I'm master on all of these, and I've got a certain set of these sync nodes. And over here on the secondary, if I go to status and CARP, all my VIPs are in backup. And it should have nearly the same set of sync nodes. It may not be 100%, there may be one or two different, but for the most part, they're going to be identical. And that shows you that your state synchronization is active. You can at that point, if you want to, you can disable CARP on the primary to trigger a failover to the secondary and then fail back, running a LAN client the whole time, making sure you can get out what you need to do. And then, you fail back and retest it. If you're downloading or streaming audio, streaming video, most of those are okay. There's some buffering going on or some recovery time. There might be a little bit of a glitch. VoIP, you might notice a disruption in VoIP because there will be about a second or so of time before the secondary picks up. It's all very nice to do. For troubleshooting, again, as I mentioned, most of the issues are going to be switch issues, but you do need to make sure if you've got a CARP VIP that shows an init, it's probably because your interface for that VIP is unplugged. You cannot have a VIP on an interface and leave it unplugged or it will mess with your CARP status. So if you're going to have an interface unplugged long term, you need to remove the CARP VIP from that interface or any CARP VIPs from that interface. But if your interface is up and the VIP still shows init, you might have to edit and save it just to refresh the settings for that VIP at the OS level. If you have like a dual master or dual backup scenario, you might need to make sure that there's no conflicting VHIDs on the network, like other clusters using the same IDs in the same segments. So you don't want that. Make sure your subnet masks are right on your VIPs. But most of these issues, again, they're going to be switch or L2 issues. You're going to disable IGMP snooping. Make sure you disable any broadcast or multicast storm control on these segments because it's very easy to trip it with CARP, even though it's not very high level for whatever reason. Switches tend to freak out and block it. You might have to, in some cases, you may even need a different switch. And then there are other concerns, almost all layer 2. So, be careful there. And check your system logs, firewall logs, notices, and things. Make sure there's no errors there. But again, I think I went into a lot more detail on that in the last Hangout, and there's also a lot more detailed info on troubleshooting and testing in the book and on the wiki. So when it comes to upgrading, just to reiterate, because some people still are missing pieces of this when they try, when you upgrade a cluster, a first step always before any upgrade is make sure you read the changelog on the wiki, the blog post, and the upgrade guide on the wiki. We add things to those all the time, especially as we find issues and note them. Especially when it comes to doing a failover cluster, you need to make sure you're taking a good path. Before you do anything else, read those and take a backup. Always take a backup before you start. Then the upgrade procedure is you upgrade your secondary, you test it, make sure it's okay. Switch the CARP to maintenance mode on the primary, which will make the secondary take over. then run all your testing again. Make sure you can still get out, make sure everything's working, make sure VPNs, whatever, they're all working. And then once that's confirmed, upgrade the primary. And then once you've made sure it's all okay, then you can exit maintenance mode on the primary and run your tests again. And if at that point everything's okay. So as I mentioned before, the details of the multi-WAN, if you need more detail for that, it's in the March 2016 Hangout, just a couple of months ago. And that was also on 2.3. The basics of CARP and a lot more detail about the design and planning and everything else is in the June 2015 Hangout. That's up in the archive. Even though that was done on 2.2, all the basics are the same, all the planning is the same, the theory and the procedures, it's all the same. So I'll open it up to questions now. If you want to go ahead and type out some questions, I'll give you a couple of moments here to get everything typed out. I know it takes a while to type, so if you do plan on typing something, you might want to type a word or two and let me know there's a question coming so I don't cut anybody off. So go ahead and type out your questions here. I'll just give it just a moment for some questions to build up. I'll be right back. All right, let's see, Tom says, per company security policy, we disable admin or other built-in accounts on systems. Wants to know if it's possible to use admin for the synchronization. No, at the moment, admin is the only account that can be used for synchronization. There's no way to do that with another account. We have tried to allow that in the past and hit a bunch of roadblocks, mostly because it is very difficult to ensure that any other account is going to have all of the necessary rights and privileges that it needs to be able to pull off the synchronization. So that's something I covered in the previous Hangout, I believe. But no, at the moment, you're bound to admin. Let's see, is this at all possible to set up with dynamic IPs or from our ISP or an absolute requirement to use static addresses, any workaround? I did cover that a bit. Any proper CARP is going to use static addresses. There's not a good way to do it with dynamic. You can get sort of, it can work, but you're going to have problems. If there's no CARP on that segment, which you can't have CARP without static addresses for the IP redundancy. If you don't have that, an outage of the WAN interface is not going to trigger a failover to your secondary unit. Also, if you do trigger a failover to the secondary unit, it will not be a smooth transition. The states won't match up. Everybody's going to have to reconnect and make new connections going out of the secondary. And when the primary recovers, again, it's going to be a harsh transition back to the primary. So technically, it can half function, but it's not going to be a proper CARP setup, and you're gonna have a bad time. If you have like just one WAN like that, it might be okay to do, like I mentioned earlier, to have a NAT device in front of pfSense, presenting a static subnet to pfSense on the back end, and let the dynamic address be handled by the other device, which could be another pfSense box. It could be something else. It needs to be a layer of abstraction ahead so pfSense doesn't see the dynamic part. That can work, but we don't recommend it because it involves doing NAT. So I mean, it's a tough situation, but you really cannot have full proper redundancy without static addresses. All right, anybody else? I know I had that one question earlier. Let me go back. I think I worked it in though. Let's see. Oh, Ryan, you were asking about tearing down a CARP, removing a secondary and changing it back to a primary. And I think I kind of hit that when I was going through. Basically, all you would really have to do is take out your DHCP failover peer IPs, take out your XML RPC sync settings, take out your pfSync settings, and that's it. because at that point it would not be trying to communicate with a secondary. I mean, if you had any packages that had XML RPC, you'd have to disable it there. But you can run a single unit with CARP, and that's fine. You could, if you can't get VMware and CARP to work together nicely, you could change those CARP VIPs to IP alias VIPs and still be fine. But yeah, the other multicast settings are still necessary when it's a single VMware host, because it's not necessarily about the two units seeing each other as it is about the CARP VIP having a different MAC address. And so it has to be allowed to send from that port on multiple MAC addresses, and it has to receive on multiple MAC addresses, and it has to change the MAC address on the port. So all of that is in the VMware switch. So you could just change those VIPs over to IP alias VIPs if you wanted to, or you could leave them as CARP and make your vSwitch adjustments. You can just change it to an IP alias. There's no, I mean, you don't have to worry too much about the other settings. You can just pick IP alias, leave the IP address and subnet set the same, save and apply it. I don't know if I would try to do that in XML RPC or in XML, just trying to search and replace. I'm certain you could change one or two and then see what it did and then extrapolate from that what you need to do. But you might, there's a chance you might leave some other dangling settings in there that wouldn't be good to have. But yeah, just change a couple of them and see what it did, and then you could maybe replicate that across the rest of them in some automated fashion. Yeah, migrating between nicknames is a different thing. That's much easier to do with search and replace in the XML. That's fine. But no, there's no other way to bulk change interfaces. But getting a little off track there. But yeah, you're doing that. That's fine. It's just the IP address transitions and things like that. When you change from one type to another, it might remove certain things or clean things up, other settings. So you might just need to make a change in the GUI, look at what it did, and then kind of extrapolate from there what you need, the changes you need to make on all the other entries. Unless you've got like hundreds of them, that you wouldn't really need to worry about that anyway. So, all right. Anybody else? Any other questions? And no, we don't have an email address for questions. She was asking if we have if we can email questions in later about the Hangout. You can post in the forum. If you have support, you can ask us on support. You could also, post on Reddit or wherever. But we don't have a back and forth. There's no support available for the gold. The goal is just the Hangout Q&A, things like that. If you could choose a highly available VM as a pair of hardware firewalls, what would you pick? Versus a pair of hardware firewalls. I honestly, myself, I would go for bare metal in most cases. There are good cases for virtualized firewalls, but in most cases we have found that, for performance and for reliability, we've liked to move those out to bare metal, just because, if things on the VM infrastructure rely on the firewall, you can get into kind of a chicken and egg scenario, especially if you need to manage the hypervisor out of band from there. Like say if there's a problem with the hypervisor, if your firewall's in the hypervisor, you wouldn't have a way to get to it to manage it remotely, that is. All right, let's see. Let's see, do we have a diagnostic procedure for chattering CARP failover master and standby go back and forth hundreds of times? Most often that is a problem at layer 2. Either one of them is got some, like there's a looping multicast, or there's something at layer 2 causing the packets to be repeated or duplicated. We've seen that happen before, especially in VMware. Like if you've got the hypervisor has teamed NICs or that aren't like an LACP, but they're both connected to the same switch, and so the CARPs are being like duplicated essentially at layer 2, and it's seeing both come back in. Again, almost always layer 2 issue, so you got to make sure to fix your layer 2. Physical hardware, you can still have that happen if your switches are doing something weird, if you have a layer 2 loop, or if you have, again, NIC teaming somewhere, or NIC failover that's not LACP, that kind of stuff. But it's all, again, it's if they're flapping, it's because something at layer 2 is duplicating them, or they are being slowed down or mangled in some way by the switch. But it's 99.999% of the time it's your switch or something connected to that switch outside the firewall. All right. Well, it looks like we're just a little bit over time, so I want to call it there. If you have any more questions or anything like that, you can save them up for the next Hangout, or you can post them on the forum, post them on Reddit, wherever we're monitoring all those channels. If you have any ideas for future Hangouts, again, you can post them on the forum, blog post, Reddit, wherever. Just get them to us, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.